The story begins in a small village named Harlow, where a boy named Craig is walking to the church with his dad. Craig's mother passed away a few months ago, so he and his dad never miss a Sunday at church. There Craig reads the Bible every Sunday. Sitting there is an elderly billionaire named Mr. Harrigan, who is impressed with Craig's reading style. The same evening Mr. Harrigan heads over to Craig's place and invites Craig to come over and read books at his house 3 times a week, for which he'll pay him $5 an hour. This is because Mr. Harrigan is getting older and his eyesight is deteriorating, making it difficult for him to read books. Craig accepts Mr. Harrigan's proposal, and not just because $5 an hour is tempting for an 11-year-old but also because he needs to escape his lonely house. Following that, Craig starts showing up regularly at Mr. Harrigan's mansion to read books for him 3 times a week. Harrigan's place is pretty massive, but there are only 3 folks residing there: Mr. Harrigan himself, the gardener, and a maid. One day when Craig arrives at Mr. Harrigan's house for their reading session, he doesn't find him around. Curiosity piqued, Craig decides to peek into his closet, but out of nowhere Mr. Harrigan pops up and catches him in the act. He tells Craig that he can ask him anything he wants to know, and he'll get an honest answer. Craig asks what's in this closet, to which Mr. Harrigan replies, "Terrible secrets." Following that, Craig carries on with his usual routine of reading books, and after wrapping up, he asks Mr. Harrigan about what he does after Craig leaves. Mr. Harrigan tells him he reads stock market and finance news. Craig finds this boring, but Mr. Harrigan finds finance exhilarating. According to him, money is a power that has no equal, and when used wisely, it can be quite ruthless to our enemies. After chatting with Mr. Harrigan, Craig becomes curious about him and researches more about him at the internet cafe. He discovers that all of Mr. Harrigan's relationships have been very strained, and he has never had any children. He always prioritized his work and didn't treat his employees well, which even led some of the employees to take their own lives. Essentially, his personality was similar to Steve Jobs. Then the scene transitions to 5 years later, and Craig continues to read books for Mr. Harrigan. Over the years, they have developed a strong friendship, with Mr. Harrigan often explaining the meanings of lines written in the books to him. Craig, now being 16 years old, is starting his high school this year. A senior student explains all the dangers, rules, and challenges present in high school to the newcomers. In high school, most of the students own smartphones, and groups are divided based on the brand of phones they use. Motorola users are often considered lower-tier students, while Samsung users are seen as average, and iPhone users are regarded as the most elite and popular kids. These students spend their entire day engrossed in their phones, wasting their parents' money. Craig feels a surge of excitement when he sees them using iPhone 4, which is the latest model. But unfortunately, neither he nor his mates own any phones. After school dismissal, a psycho bully named Kenny approaches Craig and expects him to polish his shoes, which is a freshman's job. Craig refuses to do so, and Kenny threatens him that if he doesn't do so, he'll shove this polisher down his throat. Just then the science teacher Ms. Hart arrives and catches Kenny bullying Craig. However, Craig saves Kenny by saying that he was just asking him about getting a sandwich. Despite this, Kenny continues to threaten Craig, promising him a bad time in the future. After this incident, Craig goes to Mr. Harrigan and asks if anyone has ever tried to bully him or take advantage of him, and if yes, how he dealt with it. Mr. Harrigan replies that he has been bullied many times in his life and has dealt with it harshly. On Christmas Eve, Craig receives a Red Devil lottery ticket from Mr. Harrigan, something he occasionally gives him, but Craig has never won before. However, this time luck smiles on him, and he hits the jackpot with a whopping $3,000. He shows this to his dad, who surprises him with an iPhone. Overwhelmed with joy, Craig hugs his dad tightly. He then makes his first call from his iPhone to Mr. Harrigan to wish him Merry Christmas and share the news about his lottery win. He also tells him about his new iPhone, but Mr. Harrigan advises against using these things, as they are filled with radiation. The following day at school, Craig proudly flaunts his iPhone to his friends and joins the iPhone group, where his crush is also present. Eventually, Craig's friends also get their phones and join the corresponding groups. One day after the reading session, Mr. Harrigan asks Craig, why does he still comes here after 5 years, given that he is now in high school and can have any social life and girlfriends. Craig replies that he comes here because he likes the smell of his books and enjoys Mr. Harrigan's company, not out of a sense of obligation. Also, when he sits here and reads the books aloud, he feels a sense of power that he doesn't feel outside. Hurt by Mr. Harrigan's question, Craig buys a new iPhone with his lotto money and gifts it to Mr. Harrigan the next day. Mr. Harrigan appreciates the sentiment but refuses the gift, explaining that we don't own things, things own us. That's why he doesn't even keep television or radio in his house, which he believes is a waste of time. Despite this, Craig shows him the features of the iPhone, including the stock market app with real-time price fluctuations, so he doesn't have to wait for the newspaper for the next day. Mr. Harrigan is amazed by this feature and realizes he has been arrogant by refusing such technology for so long. Craig also shows him a news app and the calling feature. Mr. Harrigan excitedly dials his finance manager on the iPhone to make adjustments to his portfolio. After that, Craig teaches Mr. Harrigan the new features of his iPhone every time he visits his house, such as Yahoo, Google, voicemail, etc. Mr. Harrigan didn't like his phone's ringtone, so Craig even sets a new ringtone for him, which is Mr. Harrigan's favorite song, Stand By Your Man. One day Mr. Harrigan asks Craig about the articles he has been reading on his phone, mentioning that they are all free without any ads or subscriptions. He used to pay subscription fees for similar content before. Craig feels proud hearing this. However, Mr. Harrigan explains that it is like a drug. These platforms are creating a dependency, and the algorithm is so powerful that it recommends me exactly what I want to see next. He predicts a future where these sites will be filled with fake news, spams, political propaganda, and journalists distorting facts in the name of news. The next day at school, Craig playfully compliments his crush on her sweater via iMessage. However, the bully Kenny harasses Craig again, grabbing his iPhone and tossing it in the air. While being with Mr. Harrigan, Craig asks him why, despite being wealthy and having the means to live anywhere in the world, he chose to stay in this small village. Mr. Harrigan explains that he has lived in many places around the world, but the peace he finds in Harlow is unmatched. He prefers solitude because he dislikes being around too many people. Mr. Harrigan warns Craig that when he ventures into the city to build his career, he will encounter numerous people he has to deal with and will also make enemies. Before Craig leaves, Mr. Harrigan makes him promise that whenever someone tries to make his life difficult, Craig will dispatch them with haste. The next time Craig visits Mr. Harrigan's house, he finds him lying unconscious on the chair, holding his iPhone with Craig's contact open. Craig checks his pulse and realizes that he has passed away. Craig immediately dials his dad because all the staff members are also on leave today. Craig's dad asks him to wait there while he calls for an ambulance. Craig is devastated as he had developed a strong bond with Mr. Harrigan over the years. He sits by Mr. Harrigan's lifeless body and reads a book one last time, with tears streaming down his face. That night Craig sends a message to Mr. Harrigan that says, "I will miss our afternoons together." On the next day at funeral, Craig reads the Bible in the church and puts Mr. Harrigan's iPhone inside his coat before leaving. After burying Mr. Harrigan, Craig and his dad are approached by Mr. Harrigan's financial manager. He hands Craig a letter that Mr. Harrigan had instructed him to deliver after his death. Craig opens the letter in the car and finds a heartfelt message from Mr. Harrigan. In the letter, Mr. Harrigan reveals that he has left $800,000 for Craig to complete his college education and pursue his screenwriting career in the city. The letter is filled with emotional words and ends with a phrase, "I will miss our afternoons together," which astonishes Craig because he had sent Mr. Harrigan the exact same message last night. That night, feeling sad, Craig leaves a voicemail to Mr. Harrigan, appreciating the money he left for him. However, he adds that he would give up that money just to have him still around. After waking up in the morning, Craig checks his phone and is shocked to find a reply from Mr. Harrigan. However, the message is quite weird with some random alphabets. Craig rushes downstairs and shows this to his dad, insisting that Mr. Harrigan is still breathing and they accidentally buried him alive. He urges his dad to quickly call a bulldozer to dig Mr. Harrigan out. However, his dad patiently tells him that someone might be playing a prank on him by cloning or hacking Mr. Harrigan's phone. Craig argues that if it were a prank, there would be some humorous element in the message like, "Help, I'm trapped in a box." His dad calmly sits him down and explains that doctors had thoroughly checked Mr. Harrigan, confirming that he had passed away due to a heart attack. He reassures Craig that once people are deceased, they don't come back to life. However, Craig is still not convinced by his dad's explanation and decides to visit Mr. Harrigan's grave. He presses his ears against the ground and suddenly hears Mr. Harrigan's phone ringing, sending a chill down his spine. He then goes back to Mr. Harrigan's house and questions the maid about Mr. Harrigan's life. She describes him as a really kind and generous man who looked out for everyone, just as he did for Craig. However, she also reveals a darker side of him. Once Mr. Harrigan had hired a gardener named Dusty. Dusty had worked for only 8 months when Mr. Harrigan caught him stealing and immediately fired him from the job. Dusty didn't apologize, thinking that was the end of the matter. But what Mr. Harrigan did to him afterward, the maid cryptically states, is something Craig is better off not knowing. After a few days without receiving any more messages from Mr. Harrigan, Craig starts leading a normal life, brushing off the message from Mr. Harrigan as a mere prank. He goes to school daily and gradually falls back into his routine. One day the police catch Kenny selling grass at school, resulting in his expulsion. Convinced that Craig is the one who reported him, Kenny seeks revenge by violently attacking Craig during the school dance festival. Craig's teacher Ms. Hart tends to his wounds and suggests reporting Kenny to the police. However, Craig refuses and claims that it wasn't Kenny. Craig then compliments his teacher on her pleasant scent, and she reveals it's the fragrance of Booth Bay soap, her favorite. They share a moment of tension, and Craig thanks her sincerely for her support. At night, Craig finds himself in the restroom, pouring his heart out to Mr. Harrigan over the phone. He tells him about the bully at school who had picked on him, recounting how he fought back, just as he had promised Mr. Harrigan, even though he ultimately lost due to the bully's bigger size. He expresses his wish for Mr. Harrigan to be there to offer him advice. The next morning, Craig receives a message from his friend, sharing the news of Kenny's death in an accident. Completely shocked, Craig joins his friends in their car to Kenny's house and witness Kenny's body being taken away in an ambulance. Deeply troubled by these events, Craig finds himself grappling with a profound sense of guilt, blaming himself for Kenny's death because he had wished ill upon him. Ms. Hart notices his downcast demeanor and talks to him after school. She tries to console him, explaining that Kenny was a psychologically troubled kid with a troubled family background, and Craig shouldn't dwell too much on his thoughts about Kenny. Before leaving, Craig frantically asks Ms. Hart if she believes in ghosts. She replies that she doesn't think much about such things, but her grandmother used to say that one should never summon the dead because not all ghosts are holy. Afterward, Craig goes to Mr. Harrigan's former employee Dusty's house to learn more about his past. There he learns that Dusty had passed away several years ago. Mr. Harrigan had fired Dusty for stealing, and due to Mr. Harrigan's influence, Dusty couldn't find another job. And left with no other option, he tragically took his own life by crashing his car into a garage. At night, Craig calls Mr. Harrigan and asks him to knock on his wall 3 times if he has any involvement in Kenny's death. After saying this, he tensely waits for the knocks on the wall, only to be startled by his phone ringing with Mr. Harrigan's call. Trembling, Craig picks up the phone, and suddenly the phone vibrates with another weird message from Mr. Harrigan. The following day, Craig goes straight to the church and confides in the pastor about everything. The pastor tells him that Kenny's death was due to his own mistakes, not because of any spirit. Kenny had been heavily intoxicated and fell from his second-story window while trying to sneak out. The pastor reassures Craig that it's all in his mind and suggests that someone might have hacked Mr. Harrigan's phone, causing these calls and messages. But then we see Kenny's body lying on the ground, with shoe wax stuffed down his mouth, just like he had once threatened Craig. Strangely, Kenny met his end in the same way he had threatened. Afterward, Craig goes to the Apple Service Center where he explains that he's been receiving calls and messages repeatedly from a deactivated number. The expert informs him that messages can sometimes get stuck in the phone's software and be received late. He replaces Craig's iPhone for free and mentions that they'll donate the old phone to those in need. However, Craig tells him that his sister needs a phone and he will give it to her himself. With his new phone, Craig attempts to call Mr. Harrigan, but this time the call doesn't go through because the number has been deactivated. Craig breathes a sigh of relief and puts his old iPhone in a box and locks it in his closet. Craig gradually returns to his normal life, and the burden on his heart begins to lighten. After graduating from high school, he leaves his hometown and moves to LA to pursue his screenwriting career, embarking on a new chapter in his life. Everything seems to be going well until one day he receives a call from his dad, informing him that his teacher Ms. Hart has passed away in a car accident, and her fiancé is in critical condition. This news shocks Craig deeply because he was very close to Ms. Hart and she had always supported him throughout his school years. Craig returns to his hometown Harlow, where he attends Ms. Hart's funeral with his old friends, and they are all deeply saddened. They inform Craig that a troublemaker named Dean Whitmore was drunk driving and caused the accident that led to Ms. Hart's demise. Dean doesn't even have a valid driver's license, and before this incident he had 4 previous cases against him, but due to his dad's wealth and influence, he always managed to get away with it. They all yearn for justice for Ms. Hart, but once again the court lets him off with a 6-month rehab order. Fueled by a deep sense of injustice, Craig storms to his closet and retrieves his old iPhone. He calls Mr. Harrigan and vents out his frustration, urging him to kill Dean Whitmore. Craig had made this wish in the heat of the moment, but later he couldn't stop feeling regret about it. A few days later, he learns about Dean's death in the rehabilitation center. Shocked by all this, Craig visits the rehab facility and pays $200 to a worker there, asking about the cause of Dean's death. The man reveals that Dean had taken his own life by ingesting soap in the bathroom, which got stuck in his throat. It wasn't just any soap, it was the Boothbay soap, Ms. Hart's favorite. Upon learning all this, Craig becomes utterly convinced that Mr. Harrigan's spirit is indeed real. He feels overwhelmed with regret and frustration, realizing that his actions have led to the loss of 2 lives. After that, Craig goes to Mr. Harrigan's house and opens the closet that Mr. Harrigan had prevented him from opening in his childhood. Inside, he discovers information about Mr. Harrigan's life. Craig learns that Mr. Harrigan's mother also passed away during his childhood, and his upbringing was similar to Craig's, as he too experienced loneliness in his childhood. Perhaps this shared experience was why Mr. Harrigan chose Craig to read books, even though he had many excellent readers to choose from. He could relate to Craig's life, and in many ways they were very much alike. In the next scene, Craig sits in front of Mr. Harrigan's grave and says, "I understand the meaning of your message now. You want to say, Craig, stop hurting me and let me rest." Afterward, Craig goes to his mother's grave, a place he had visited only once in his life because it reminds him that his mother is no longer with him. After bidding the final farewell to both of them, Craig rushes off to a cliff. He tosses his old iPhone into the river below and is about to throw his new iPhone as well, but realizes that surviving without a smartphone in today's world is next to impossible. As he leaves, he makes a wish that when he dies, he would like to be buried with empty pockets. Subscribe to the channel if you think Samsung is better than iPhone. See you in the next video. Till then, take care and goodbye.